In this video, we're going to be talking about VFX explosions and why you're probably doing them wrong. There's 5 key points to hit when doing explosions that I think are critical to making it look realistic. And those are scale, speed, color, camera shake, and interaction. So this is the Nuke script for the explosion shot that I've done for this video. Before anyone turns off the video because they don't use Nuke, I'm going to talk very broadly about all of the techniques in this video, so it's not software specific. You can do this in After Effects or HitFilm or Fusion, doesn't matter. This Nuke script and the source footage from this video are going to be available on Patreon if anyone wants to download them and have a play themselves. First of all, I just want to touch on a quick misconception when using explosion stock footage. For this video, I'm using this piece of stock footage which is from Action VFX. It's a really nice 2K explosion. Usually with people that don't have much experience with VFX, they'll see an element like this on a black background that's quite bright and they'll go, okay, all I need to do is screen this over the footage. The problem with setting it to screen, as you're about to see, is that it makes everything that's not bright completely invisible. The way the screen merge operation works is it makes anything that's completely white opaque, anything that's completely black transparent, and any of the luminance values in between black and white get a certain level of transparency depending on how dark or bright they are. So while the highlights on the fire transfer pretty well, you can see that all of the smoke and everything goes almost completely transparent. It's the same if you do plus or add in After Effects. This is the result. So actually using a merge operation like that on a piece of footage to get rid of the black background isn't how you should composite it at all. So what's the alternative? Well, usually for this sort of thing, if it's on a black background, the best thing you can do is luma key this stock footage. What that means for anybody that's not familiar with the term is doing a key based on the luminance or the brightness of the footage, the same way you would key a green screen or a blue screen for that specific color. In Nuke, we can do this using a keyer node. If you're using After Effects, it's the same thing but with the levels, and there'll be very similar tools in all compositing packages. Then what you can do is use the alpha as the method of overlaying the explosion onto your footage. So I can plug this straight in, and instead of using a plus operation, I can set this back to over, which is the default. Then from here, once you can see what it looks like, you can then tweak the key until you get a much better edge on the explosion overall. So that's the correct way to put an explosion over the top of your footage. The thing with stock elements of explosions is they're not all the same. For example, this one that I'm using in this shot is quite large scale, and you can tell that from the frequency of how the smoke moves, these little bits that ping off of it. In comparison, I've got a much smaller one here that's just a small fireball. And it's really important when choosing an element to composite that you pick something that's the appropriate scale. For example, you couldn't take an explosion that's this sort of size and scale it right down to be tiny, like this, because it just doesn't make sense. And equally, you couldn't take this tiny fireball and make it massive, because again, it wouldn't really fit. So make sure when you're choosing your elements to put into the shot that you pick something that's the correct scale. The next thing that I think is really important is speed. This is some footage of an atom bomb going off really far in the distance, and you can see exactly how slowly the explosion is actually happening. And the speed that the mushroom cloud is rising and the smoke is moving is really quite slow because of the scale of the explosion. Generally speaking, if you're choosing an element and you composite it at the same sort of scale that it was actually filmed at, then it will probably look correct and won't need any speed changes. But if you're taking a bit of creative licensing and making it bigger or smaller, if you're making it bigger, you would want to slow it down a bit to make the scale feel larger. So for example, I can add a retime node and slow this down to 50%. This is going to make the scale of the whole thing feel a lot larger because it's moving slower. Equally, if you're taking quite a big explosion and scaling it down, you would want to speed it up so the timing feels correct. So for example, if I wanted this to be quicker, I could double the speed of it or something in between. And this speed change now makes the explosion feel quite a bit smaller, or like it's much closer to the camera. The third point is color, and I'm also going to kind of include exposure or brightness in this as well. The thing that a lot of beginners forget when they're comping explosions or fire is that these are really bright light sources. So if you're filming at daytime like I am here and you're exposing for a daytime shot, the fire will most likely be quite close to being the correct exposure, so you'll see more of the details in the highlights and the color. Whereas if you're filming at night, the reality is if you're exposing for a nighttime scene and then you introduce some fire or a light source, it will be massively overexposed. And in that case, it will be completely white and blown out in the camera sensor. Here's a few examples of what that looks like. And the way light works when things get really bright is they also become more desaturated, because as the brightness increases and they become closer to white and clipping in the camera sensor, you see less and less color. So it's important when taking elements like this that are filmed at a correct exposure to capture the detail of the element itself, to actually put them into your shot correctly. So if I turn off all of the color corrections I did, you can see what it looks like just straight out of the box. You can see loads of the yellowy orange in the fire where it's really saturated, and the smoke is also way too dark compared to the colors and the tones in the shot. So the process that I've gone through here is, first of all, I'm turning the exposure up. That's not a massive change, but it's just matching the brightness a little bit better to what's in the shot. Then I've got a grade node that's just adding a little bit of contrast. It's turning up the gain and dropping the gamma, which basically makes the bright parts of the image brighter and the midtones and the shadows get darker, so the smoke. Then I've got some nodes that are correcting the color of the fire itself. If I turn these on, you can see what they're doing. They're taking quite a bit of the saturation out of the fire. This level of saturation feels a lot more correct to me compared to everything around it. And then finally, this last node is lifting the black point of the explosion quite a bit, which is making the smoke a lot less dark. Where it is before, the black levels in the smoke are actually a lot darker than anything else around it. You can see this black metal fence is almost like a middle grey compared to what's in the smoke. So I use this node just to lift the black point and the gamma slightly in the shot, and that's bringing the level of the explosion element into the same place as the footage itself. And if I turn all of these on and off, you can see the before and after. That's making a huge difference. Next up, we have camera shake. When I was filming this, I actually simulated the camera shake myself. The way I did it is as I was filming, I was holding the camera here with one hand, and then I used my other hand and smacked myself on the arm. And I did that to simulate the shockwave that you would feel from an explosion. And then as my hand kind of recovers, you can see the camera shake diminishes and goes back to normal. If you can, it's good to get that kind of thing in camera because it looks better. If you have to do it in post, there's two options. The first one, which isn't my favorite, is you can do the camera shake completely in post. Nuke actually has a camera shake node that you can use, and After Effects has stuff like the wiggle expression that you can use to just animate a bit of a procedural wobble. This kind of works, and if you animate it, you can get something that's quite realistic. But I always feel like it never quite gets all the way there. So my favorite way to add camera shake if you don't have it in the footage is to just film it yourself. What I like to do is just put a couple of tracking markers on a wall and then take my phone and just film the tracking markers. Then while you're filming, simulate the camera shake that you want, and then what you can do is bring that into your compositing software and apply that tracking data to your footage. And the final point is interaction. What I mean for this is stuff like adding interactive light and shadow from the explosion, and also having some stuff interact with it in the environment. Foolishly, I filmed this in a place that has loads of leaves on the floor, as you can see, and obviously if the explosion went off, all of these would get blown up into the air. I did briefly consider painting these out of the shot and then doing some sort of Blender leaf simulation, but that would just be too much work for this video. So pretend these aren't there. But what I have done is add some lighting interaction onto the floor and the walls, and I've also added some shadows from the smoke. It's important to add shadows as well as light. It's very easy to just think, oh, it's a massive explosion, so I'll just brighten the floor up a bit. But in reality, you can see, for example, the light of the explosion is here, and there's a load of dark smoke in between the explosion and this wall. So the light from the explosion wouldn't really reach that much over here on this back wall because there's smoke in the way. And if anything, it would cast some shadows through the smoke onto that wall, and I put some shadows from the smoke on the floor here and around the base of the explosion. And in contrast to that, this wall here is right next to the explosion, so this would actually need to get lots of light interaction on it. So if I turn off what I've done, first of all, you can see here, this is the lighting from the explosion. A lot of it is on the floor around the base where it's most bright, obviously, and then I've done a soft fall off so that some of it still reaches the edges of the frame. That's just done by drawing a few masks in the areas that I wanted them, and these are tracked into the shot so that it moves with the camera. Then as well as the light, like I said, I've also added some shadow. What I did for this is I took the base of the explosion and I cut it out using a mask and just used the alpha, and then I eroded it out slightly and used that as a mask to create a shadow on the floor. So what that does is as the explosion grows, it will also expand this mask of the shadow, and it will just kind of move with the explosion as it gets bigger. Then as well as lighting interaction, I comped in some extra dust and debris as well. This is just an asset of some debris exploding up from the floor. I wanted this to feel a bit like it was the concrete from the ground exploding upwards and just making a bit of a mess. So this is with and without that, just adds a bit of extra damage into the shot. And then I put a dust wave on top that comes towards the camera as well. I kind of wanted this to feel a bit like a secondary shockwave that comes after the explosion. So you can see at the end of the shot, once the explosion's gone off, all of this dust kind of lifts up off the floor and hits the camera. I think it really helps to sell the impact of the explosion a bit more. So there we go, those are the 5 things that I think are really important to make a good looking explosion with visual effects. Let me know what you think in the comments below, maybe I missed something that you think is more important. Like I said, the assets from this video will be available on my Patreon for anybody that's interested. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
You don't walk, you levitate. I try